Oh, hey, welcome to our Back to School special. We named it that for a reason. It should be clear to Albertans by now that the question that we need to be asking is not, will the provincial government lie to or mislead Albertans? We saw them lie to Albertans when they swore that they would not de-index AISH, and they did. We saw it when they walked back their plan to sell off certain delisted Alberta parks, and we saw it most recently when Jason Kenney claimed that he was unaware that his staff, various MLAs, and at least one minister traveled during the holidays, despite the fact that the government had issued a travel advisory against traveling. So no, the question that Albertans need to be asking isn't if the Alberta government is lying to them, it's when. Before we get too far into that, though, let's take a trip down memory lane and go back to school. Last summer, one of the biggest news stories of Alberta politics had to do with how the province was planning to get kids back to school and how the government was going to support that effort. After weeks of telling Alberta school boards that when it comes to purchasing personal protective equipment for students and staff, school boards were on their own, Education Minister Adriana Lagrange suddenly made an about-face.
To assist with these new guidelines, Alberta's government will provide every single kindergarten to grade 12 student with 2 reusable masks.
On August 4th, Lagrange announced that the government of Alberta would be purchasing 2 reusable masks for every student and educational staff member in the province, as well as hand sanitizer and face shields at a cost of about $10 million, which was good news. But a few people couldn't help but wonder who got the contract for this multi-million-dollar mask buy. Multiple journalists noted that they could not find any official request for proposal or purchase, an RFP, published on the government procurement website. Usually, when the government needs to buy stuff, it's done through public RFP. This makes sure that taxpayers' money is spent in a transparent and fair manner and is a safeguard against political interference and corruption when awarding contracts. The government procurement processes also include provisions for establishing standing orders and pre-approved vendor lists. Facing questions about how these masks were purchased and how those decisions were made from both the public and the media, the government released that 90% of the masks would be supplied by Old Navy, and the remaining 10% would be supplied by an Albertan company, IFR. Now, IFR is owned by a family from Red Deer, the Radfords, which is within Adriana Lagrange's riding. Red Radford donated $2,000 to Lagrange's campaign in 2019. In fact, on July 18th, Premier Kenney and Lagrange even toured IFR's Red Deer facilities and met with owner Lynn Radford. All of this raised some big red flags in the public. Why was there not a transparent RFP process? And without one, how could anyone be sure that the contract awarded to IFR wasn't political? So far, none of this is new information. It's been heavily reported and researched. We Googled. It's easy. Immediately, the media was all over the connections between IFR and Lagrange, and the many questions in regards to how the decisions to award the contract were made. Minister Lagrange explained that the procurement process bypassed normal RFP procedures by using emergency procurement exceptions. This was necessary as time was of the essence to fulfill the delivery before back to school. She told Albertans that the purchase was performed by the Provincial Operations Centre, part of the Alberta Emergency Management in the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. The Provincial Operations Centre was able to use emergency procurement powers to meet the short timelines. The government assured Albertans that this provided sufficient arm's length distance to dispel any concerns of interference from Alberta Education. Timothy Gerwing, press secretary for the Minister of Municipal Affairs, responsible for the Provincial Operations Centre, released a statement. Frankly, it's disappointing that some are even suggesting that, unless they're suggesting that an Albertan employer should have been eliminated from the contention because it happens to be located in a given riding. Remember that. Mr. Gerwing would have us believe that IFR was on the vendors list to start with and in contention and should not be removed from it solely because it was in Lagrange's riding. Facing public scrutiny about the fairness of the procurement process and concerns whether Lagrange ran afoul of the Conflict of Interest Act by politically interfering in the procurement process, on August 10th, Lagrange wrote a letter to the Ethics Commissioner. Lagrange assured the Ethics Commissioner that despite all signs to the contrary, everything was on the up and up. As the minister explains to us in her letter, the procurement was done through the Provincial Operations Centre, part of a different ministry, Municipal Affairs. The procurement was done outside of a normal transparent RFP process because it had to be executed so quickly. Now, right away, the minister's letter to the Ethics Commissioner is asking people to believe a lot of things completely against common sense. While Lagrange acknowledges the financial contributions of IFR's campaign to her office, she claimed that herself and her family do not have any personal connection to the Radfords or their company. Now, anyone who knows anything about Red Deer, especially the Red Deer Catholic community, would wince at that statement. Lagrange and Radford may not be BFFs, but Red Deer is a small community, the Red Deer Catholic community even smaller, and the list of influential, politically involved Catholics smaller still. Lagrange and Lynn Radford were both heavily involved and influential within the Catholic school community at the same time. There's no question that for decades they mingled in the same circles. So given that, Lagrange is clearly stretching the definition of personal connection past its recommended safety limits. Lagrange went on to assure the Ethics Commissioner that neither herself nor any political staff had any role in the selection of vendors for these masks. As we've learned time and time again, when it comes to the UCP, wording is absolutely key. Political staff seems like an odd caveat. Why not any staff? It forces the question, was the Education Ministry involved at all in the selection of mask vendors? If the procurement process was indeed bypassing RFPs because of an emergency and utilizing emergency provisions, why would Lagrange need to use this very specific wording? Especially given that the Provincial Operations Centre was supposed to be operating at arm's length. Lagrange then went on to tell the Ethics Commissioner that the Provincial Operations Centre directly contacted vendors it believed capable of meeting the technical requirements and volumes. Non-political staff at the Provincial Operations Centre alone made the final selection of vendors. So, to be clear, in her letter to the Ethics Commissioner, Lagrange made it clear that the POC independently selected the list of vendors it contacted. The selection of vendors was based entirely on technical requirements. Non-political staff at the POC alone made the final selection on vendors. Lagrange effectively swore on a stack of Bibles that despite how things look, she pinky promised that nothing shady was going on with the rewarding of part of the contract to the company owned by a donor to not only her campaign, but the Conservative dynasty in Alberta. Remember how at the beginning I said that Albertans don't need to ask if the UCP is lying? We need to be asking when. Yeah, we asked. Faced with lingering questions and a funny feeling that the minister's letter to the Ethics Commissioner may not have been, well, let's go with complete, we did what any Albertan can do. We submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Municipal Affairs for all correspondence regarding the mask procurement. And on Friday, January 8th, we got our response. Exclusive to the Breakdown, Story Western Standard, dozens of internal emails within Municipal Affairs and the Provincial Operations Centre show exactly how involved Alberta Education was in selecting the mask vendors, and it looks to us that it was ultimately political decisions that drove the selection of IFR as a vendor. Here's what we've learned. On July 21st, the Calgary City Council implemented a face mask bylaw. The next day, this prompted the province's Assistant Deputy Minister for the Pandemic Response Planning, that's quite a mouthful of a title, to send an email to the Assistant Deputy Minister in Education inquiring what effects this would have. Have you been asked by any Calgary schools for PPE given the new bylaw? 6 days passed before Alberta Education replied to the Pandemic Response Planning team on July 28th with a heads up that Alberta Education was trending towards recommending that students in grades 7 to 12 wear reusable masks. Within minutes, the Provincial Operations Centre began discussing the feasibility of procuring masks for schools, including this email from Executive Director of the Provincial Operations Centre. I am not sure the POC would be able to provide PPE in the quantities being requested at this time. To which the Provincial Operations Centre Director of Field Operations replied, when we met with Education last week, they were looking at this as a contingency, but it didn't appear as if they'd put too much thought into it yet. The procurement specialists at the Provincial Operations Centre went into high gear contacting possible vendors. Before noon on July 29th, the procurement staff within the Provincial Operations Centre had assembled a list of 4 possible vendors, Old Navy and 3 local vendors. IFR was not on this list. Let me say that again. The list assembled by the Provincial Operations Centre did not include IFR initially. That same morning, Linda Antunes, Senior Advisor within Alberta Education, sent the Provincial Operations Centre an email with subject line, IFR masks. Wait, what? Why is Alberta Education, the department that Adriana Lagrange is responsible for, name-dropping possible suppliers to the Provincial Operations Centre? And not just any vendor or a list of vendors, but one and only one specific vendor. The one whose owners donated to Lagrange's campaign. The one Lagrange and Jason Kenney visited publicly days before. Lagrange suggested to the Ethics Commissioner there was no political involvement from her ministry, but from the get-go, we have her ministry name-dropping IFR straight into the procurement process. If procurement by the Provincial Operations Centre was conducted to assure arm's length because normal, fair and transparent procurement processes were being bypassed, why is Alberta Education getting involved at all in selecting or suggesting vendor names? The Provincial Operations Centre replied, our procurement team does not have any record or previous communications with IFR masks before the Alberta Education name drop. It didn't just stop at name dropping IFR, however. In several follow-up emails, Alberta Education wanted to know more about IFR and their qualifications, including whether or not the masks were manufactured for IFR by First Nations. Why would Alberta Education be inquiring into political considerations in procurement, and not of all vendors, but one vendor specifically? Political considerations like local ownership and Indigenous ownership are often defined in government requests for proposals so that all vendors have a chance to respond transparently and fairly. But that didn't happen here. Remember that Lagrange asserted to the Ethics Commissioner that these transparent procurement processes had to be bypassed in the interest of expediency, and that the vendor was chosen by the Provincial Operations Centre alone based purely on technical reasons. Yet, here we have it in print, Alberta Education making direct inquiries about one vendor alone. Within hours of the Alberta Education name-dropping IFR, the Provincial Operations Centre contacted IFR for a proposal. IFR informed the POC that they only sell through distributors and provided a list of possible distributors. The morning of Friday, January 31st, staff from Alberta Emergency Management Agency and the Provincial Operations Centre met with Alberta Education, including the Minister of Education as well as Dr. Henshaw. It was at that meeting that the decision was made to proceed with IFR and Old Navy. The decision was made to include IFR as a local manufacturer, a decidedly political, not technical decision. Remember, prior to the Alberta Education name-dropping of IFR, the Provincial Operations Centre had also been considering 3 other local vendors. The same day, the Provincial Operations Centre sent a follow-up confirmatory email to the Ministry of Education within minutes of the meeting. This confirms that Education ultimately was aware of and approved of these vendors and was in the process of selecting the number of vendors. The emails also show that Old Navy had the best price. IFR masks were 180% more expensive. It is only in the confirmatory email after the meeting with the Minister of Education that we see for the first time a comparison of IFR with other vendors in the same email in which Education confirmed IFR as their vendor. On August 4th, Amanda Dalton from the Provincial Operations Centre sent this email to Alberta Education Assistant Deputy Minister Michael Walter and Senior Advisor Linda Antunes. Ms. Dalton tells Alberta Education, we have confirmation that Old Navy can deliver on 1.6 million masks by August 24th. We need to sign the contract with them today to be able to meet this deadline. Minutes later, Linda Antunes, senior advisor within Alberta Education, again, the department that Adriana Lagrange is responsible for, responds with this smoking gun. We need to split some of the order with IFR. Support local as well. Can you work out the numbers? Let that sink in. The Provincial Operations Centre was prepared to cut a purchase order to a single supplier, a supplier that met the technical requirements. Time was of the essence. It was Alberta Education that intervened to ensure IFR, by name, was also awarded a contract for a political reason to support local as well, despite the fact that other suppliers initially being considered were local as well. They were the lone supplier that Alberta Education proposed in the first place, whose owners contributed to the minister's campaign, that Alberta Education repeatedly inquired about through the procurement process. Scrambling and chaos ensues, and ultimately Old Navy was awarded a $3.5 million contract for 1.55 million masks at $2.30 per mask, and IFR was awarded a $636,000 contract for 150,000 masks at $4.24 per mask. The Provincial Operations Centre then went back to inform other local vendors that they had already begun negotiations with and told them, quote, Education had selected a different vendor. To summarize, Alberta Education was the first to suggest IFR as a possible supplier to the Provincial Operations Centre. Prior to this, the Provincial Operations Centre was not aware, nor had they even been considering IFR. Alberta Education ultimately decided on the vendors, contradicting Minister Lagrange's statement that Provincial Operations Centre staff alone made the final decision. The emails strongly suggest that Minister Lagrange was present at the July 31st meeting at which the vendor list was discussed and the vendor decision was ultimately made. Alberta Education repeatedly interfered with the procurement process with respect to one company alone, IFR. When it appeared that the Provincial Operations Centre was poised to award a single contract to Old Navy in the interest of expediency, Alberta Education explicitly intervened to ensure IFR, the company owned by the people who donated to Minister Lagrange's provincial election campaign, got a contract. The reasons for selecting IFR were indeed political, at the very least to support local, and not technical, as Lagrange claimed to the Ethics Commissioner. To our eyes, there can be very little doubt that not only did the department that Adriana Lagrange is responsible for interfere in the procurement process to ensure that a company owned by a donor of hers received an almost $1 million contract, but when those connections were discovered, she not only deliberately misled, if not outright lied to Albertans, but it certainly seems that she did the same thing with the Ethics Commissioner. But, as we are very clear here, we aren't journalists. A while back, we discovered that the taxpayer-funded, UCP-created, unfoipable war room was using taxpayer money to support conservative PACs and potentially influence the outcome of elections elsewhere in Canada. We offered to make all of that information available to any journalists who were interested. We're doing the same thing again. Because we believe that Albertans deserve better than what this appears to us to be. Blatant cronyism, corruption, and the betrayal of Albertans' trust. And because of the insane amount of exactly those things, it's getting harder and harder to keep track of just how bad this government appears to be at handling things. So we went ahead and commissioned this. At least tomorrow's a new day.
If this is contradictory to what Adriana Lagrange said, that's something that needs to be addressed. It can't just sort of be left by the wayside, because we need to be able to trust our government.
Yeah. Okay, Nate, I got to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for sharing that story with us. As a matter of fact, my executive producer has just walked in, Mike Tarasco, and actually we have a statement now from the government.
Yeah, I just handed it to you there, Jock. I've got a follow-up to that follow-up, so you're welcome to read it. It basically, in summary, a statement from the government says that Ms. Antunes, who is the person that we're looking at as far as the emails are concerned, is supposedly not a member of the ministry.
Not political staff, or not part of the minister's office, correct?
Yeah. You can, if you want to read what the actual terminology that they put on her as a title,
She's a career public servant. A cursory search shows that Ms. Antunes is a career public servant. Neither Minister Lagrange or any of her political staff had a hand in awarding the school mask procurement contracts, nor did we direct the bureaucracy in Alberta Education to push for IFR work, where Minister Lagrange only learned about the winning vendors the day the details were released to the media.
Yeah, about that. Remember back in January when we did our Back to School special? You know, the one where we pointed out that for Albertans, it's not a question of if the Alberta government is lying to them, it's a question of when. That episode came out of the announcement from August of 2020 when Education Minister Adriana Lagrange announced that after months of pressure, the Alberta government would be supplying teachers and students with masks to help protect them when they return to school. But a few things definitely stuck out as odd with the way that the government seemed to make the decision who they would be buying all of those masks from. At the end of the day, the government went with two companies to provide the masks, Old Navy and a local vendor, IFR. Now, Old Navy is owned by the Gap, and their supply chain has had some pretty big problems with multiple news organizations and human rights groups raising the alarm about abusive people, particularly women, inside of that supply chain. But from a purely, what about Alberta standpoint, IFR was the one that really stood out. Just a couple of weeks before the announcement of the contracts, Adriana Lagrange had recommended that Jason Kenney take a tour of IFR, which was a convenient commute for her because IFR is a company in her own constituency. But the connections go back farther and apparently much deeper than that. It turns out one of the owners of IFR actually donated thousands of dollars to Lagrange's 2019 campaign to get elected as an MLA, and that created a lot of questions as to how they were the only Alberta-based company that got a contract. Jason Kenney was quick to come out and claim that an RFP was issued and an independent third party chose the vendors.
My understanding is that the procurement process was handled by an independent third party. Minister was not involved whatsoever. And this is a major central Alberta manufacturing company that produces equipment like this. In fact, they retooled, as I understand, to produce masks here in Alberta on a large scale. And so my understanding is that when a third party on behalf of the government department put out requests for proposals, they submitted a bid and they won a portion of the work in a transparent arm's length process, which is exactly how the system should work.
Except that wasn't at all true. There was no RFP issued. The government approached a variety of companies to see if they could provide the needed number of masks. How do we know? Because Adriana Lagrange said so in her own letter to the Alberta Ethics Commissioner from August 10th. UCP press secretaries made it sound like IFR was always on the list and then tried to suggest that excluding them just because their owners had donated to Lagrange would be irresponsible. But that forces the question, how do you exclude a company that wasn't even on the list of companies to start with? Because when the government put together their list of companies they believed could possibly provide the type of masks in the volume needed and in the time frame needed, IFR was not on that initial list of companies. How do we know that? Because the way the whole thing played out stunk so bad that we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request and got back a ton of information. That information confirmed not only that IFR was not on the initial list of companies that was put together by the Provincial Operations Centre, or POC, but that if IFR was brought into the equation well after the fact. So, how did they get on the list? Because a senior advisor within Alberta Education specifically name-dropped IFR to the POC, asking what they knew about them. The POC said they'd never heard of them, and that senior advisor kept pushing to ensure the POC looked into them. Not only that, but it was clear that Lagrange was indeed involved in the meeting where the decisions on who to award the contracts for masks were made. For what it's worth, Dr. Henshaw was there as well. And it's clear in the emails that we received that Education was intimately involved in the decision to use IFR. When the POC almost went with just Old Navy, the same senior advisor fired back an email reiterating that IFR was to be included in the contract. The final nail in the coffin? When the POC reached out to 3 other vendors that were on the original list, they made it very clear that it was in fact Education who made the decision on who to use. So just to be clear, the Minister of Education misled Albertans, her press secretary misled Albertans, and the Premier of Alberta misled Albertans. We're just a podcast that uses puppets sometimes. So it was good news when the ethics commissioner announced that she would be doing an investigation. And on August 12th, 2021, that report was released. A couple of key details. First of all, for the government to issue a statement saying that
neither Minister Lagrange or any of her political staff had a hand in awarding the school mask procurement contracts, nor did we direct the bureaucracy in Alberta Education to push for IFR workwear. Minister Lagrange only learned about the winning vendors the day the details were released to the media.
Is proven false. The ethics commissioner clearly established in her report that Linda Antunes did report to education and in fact was tasked by the ministry specifically to look into masks. In fact, in July, she was the acting chief of staff to the Deputy Minister of Education. Furthermore, it was revealed in the ethics commissioner investigation that the inclusion of IFR came at the direction of the Assistant Deputy Minister of Education, Michael Walter, and that happened at the instruction of the Deputy Minister of Education, Andre Corbould. It's also worth noting that Michael Walter was clear that he received marketing materials for IFR from Andre Corbould, although Corbould later told the ethics commissioner that he could not recall having received material on IFR Workwear Inc. or passing it along to Michael Walter. That memory issue becomes a bit of a theme. But the ethics commissioner did also confirm that on July 30th, Linda Antunes sent out the email that clearly states, "We had a meeting with our minister this morning and there is still an interest in finding out about IFR masks." In the ethics commissioner report, she also confirms that the POC wanted to use only Old Navy at a significant cost savings to taxpayers, but despite the fact that government procurement rules applied by the POC do not favor local vendors, the former Assistant Deputy Minister of Education, who coordinated the procurement of PPE and reported to the Deputy Minister of Education, Michael Walter, explicitly told the POC to use IFR. In the report, Amanda Dalton, Director of Logistics Services for the Provincial Operations Centre, thought that it was inappropriate to pay more for IFR Workwear Inc. masks, but it seemed to her that the direction to purchase them was coming from Minister Lagrange. Ms. Dalton also indicated during her interview with the Ethics Commissioner that it is unusual for a minister to request or direct a particular vendor. And the Ethics Commissioner clearly contradicted Lagrange's statement that she only found out about IFR after the announcement by stating in her report that it is also clear that the minister was present at a meeting before suppliers were selected during which IFR Workwear Inc. masks were discussed, and that she was part of the discussion. The conclusion at that meeting was to follow up on the possibility of using IFR Workwear Inc. masks. The evidence is that Linda Antunes and the minister raised the subject during the meeting at the same time, but it may have been prompted by Michael Walter. The consensus was that the purchase of IFR Workwear Inc. masks should be continued to be investigated. How does the Ethics Commissioner make sense of all of this? Basically, by saying either that the minister is lying or she just forgot. It could be that she is not being forthright, or it could be, given the relatively last-minute decision to put students back in the classroom, and with the pressure and quantity of work involved, she did not remember what appears to have been a short discussion. And the Ethics Commissioner also applied the same reasoning to find the same for all of the highest-ranking characters in the story. Unfortunately, given the memories of the Deputy Minister, the Minister, and Nicole Williams, it is not possible to say. The conclusion to the report reads, "There is no doubt that the minister's office had some involvement with that process. As a result of the lack of memory of several key people, even though there are grounds for suspicion, it is not possible to find on a balance of probabilities that Minister Lagrange interfered with the process to the extent required by the tests set out in this report to make a finding that she improperly furthered the private interest of IFR Workwear Inc. and its owners." Some of those questions probably include how Walter got the IFR advertising materials in the first place and why he kept pushing them. So let's be clear. We know Lagrange was not truthful on multiple accounts. We know the Premier was not truthful on multiple accounts. We know the same can be said about multiple press secretaries, issues managers, and political staffers. We have said it before and we will say it again. It is not a question of whether or not the government at its highest levels lie and mislead Albertans. It is only a question of when. We did, however, take the advice of the original statement provided by the government and did a cursory search to see where the main characters are at. Nicole Williams, who by any measure has a faulty memory or deceived Albertans, remains the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Education. Michael Walter has been moved out of Education and is now a Deputy Minister for, wait for it, Regulatory Compliance, Quality Assurance, and Business Supports Division of Children's Services. Amanda Dalton remains with Municipal Affairs as a Director of Logistics Supports. We could not locate either Andre Corbould or Linda Antunes on the government directory. But that's probably because Mr. Corbould was hired by the Edmonton City Council as the new city manager in November of 2020. As for Linda Antunes, we were able to locate a LinkedIn profile that seems to show that she retired in January of 2021, right after this all blew up. But that leaves us with two undeniable facts. First, despite it being widely reported that Lagrange was cleared, the Ethics Commissioner absolutely believes further investigation is warranted. Lagrange was not cleared by any rational measure we can see. The Ethics Commissioner determined that on a balance of probabilities, it was more likely that the memories of the highest figures in this story simply failed. The second, to our interpretation at least, is that either the highest-ranking members of this story are unable to recall critical information about critical decisions made that directly benefited a donor to Lagrange's campaign, or they are straight up lying. Even the Ethics Commissioner states that she believes that the only two explanations for Lagrange's version of events is that she is deliberately misleading or that she is unable to remember. Which leaves us with this simple question. If you were the Premier of Alberta and a minister has demonstrated that she was incapable of recalling key events that brought shame to your government and arguably an entire province, what would you do? Because what Jason Kenney did was made her acting health minister during a pandemic while Tyler Shandro was on vacation. And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.